about things. And so I thought this article was quite interesting in terms of trying to make sense of some of that, some of those issues. It's already a week or so old, so it doesn't necessarily have all the latest data. Our news cycles move fast. All right. So the way I run these programs, and if you ever sub for me, you don't need to run it this way at all. You can run it completely differently. But I like.
You have to speak up.
All right. So I'm talking pretty loud, Sandy.
I hear you now very well.
Okay. I'll move the microphone closer to me.
Absolutely. If you don't speak into the microphone, I can't hear a word.
Well, actually, that's not the way this microphone works, but let's do this. We'll see. Maybe that'll. All right. All right. The point of this microphone, Sandy, is that you're not supposed to have to speak into it. It's supposed to pick up what you're saying anyway. All right. So this is by Jay Kaufman, a professor of epidemiology at McGill up in Montreal. So I like to read the article, that way everyone gets to, sort of be on the same page literally. And we can stop and discuss at any moment that makes sense. So in the winter of 1848, a 26-year-old Prussian pathologist named Rudolf Virchow was sent to investigate a typhus epidemic raging in Upper Silesia, which is now mostly Poland. After 3 weeks of meticulous observation of the stricken population, during which he carefully counted typhus cases and deaths by age, sex, occupation, and social class, he returned with a 190-page report, which it looks like we can download that report. I'm very excited. Read the whole thing right now. Well, oh no, this is a report about the report. Okay. All right. That ultimately blamed, this is one of the best things about teaching over Zoom, which we never really had before, is that you can just follow links wherever you want to go. That ultimately blamed poverty and social exclusion for the epidemic and deemed it an unnecessary crisis. I'm convinced that if you changed these conditions, the epidemic would not recur, he wrote. Which I think is very, very interesting, right? That obviously this is a medical issue, right? The epidemic, right? But the causes of the epidemic, or at least what made the epidemic as bad as it turned out to be, had as much to do with poverty as it did with actual medical issues. So Dr. Virchow was only a few years out of medical school, but his report became the foundational document of the new discipline of social medicine. His vision for health went far beyond individuals and the pathogens lurking inside them. He pioneered the careful epidemiological examination of social conditions, such as housing, education, diet, and lifestyle, and he denounced the rigid social stratification perpetuated at the time by the Catholic Church. So the same conditions of inequality that produced the Silesian, I think that S is I think one of those vowels is a nasal, but I may be wrong. So I apologize if I'm making up pronunciations. Typhus epidemic would soon foment a political revolution in Germany. And Dr. Virchow's investigation helped turn him into a political revolutionary. Medicine is social science and politics, nothing but medicine on a grand scale, he wrote, which is very interesting, right? This idea that I think we would probably, certain people would bristle at today, right? That doctors, medical professionals should be taking part in explicitly political activities. Specifically in this case, sort of what we would identify as left-wing or radical revolutionary politics.
He was a very young man, and you could question what he was saying, or not that he was talking off the top of his head. And that holds true for doctors today.
You figured it out. Okay, great. Yeah, so say more about that, Sandy. What do you mean?
Well, I think we give the medical profession more credence than they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, that's really an interesting point, right? That if medicine, right, is as much social science as it is physical science, biology, right? We should recognize that and interact with doctors accordingly, right? And doctors should also sort of acknowledge, right, that they're not coming at this, they're not coming at these issues solely from a quote unquote scientific perspective, right? Yeah, go ahead, Jean.
This really struck a chord with me. Rabbi Jim, you've met our daughter, Genevieve, who's a pediatrician at Boston Medical Center. And I think it's true of most safety net hospitals that they are very interested in the social support system of their patients. So
right.
Hospitals that have roof gardens, that are prescribing reading for children, that are concerned about housing issues. So a whole set of social aspects that doctors and scientists you wouldn't think would be interested in.
Right. I think that's, I learned about this sort of doctoring in an earlier stage of my life when I was working for the Jewish community, and we would bring people, social justice activists, we would bring people from Boston and people from Haifa into connection with one another. One of the groups that we talked with, one of the groups that was involved with us for a while was a group, and I forget the name of it now, but it was a maternal health program at Boston Medical Center. And the degree to which it was as much about social work and trying to make up for the conditions of poverty in which people were living, as opposed to what we would typically think of being medical interventions. So many of the sorts of things that you're talking about. But I do think, right, that it doesn't do us any good to pretend, as I think we often do, right, that medicine, like any of the sciences, right, is somehow a separate realm, right, endowed with greater claim to truth than other realms. And I think that happens sometimes to our detriment. And so I think that's one of the reasons I found this article to be so interesting, because of this Dr. Virchow, who's sort of pioneering this stuff, almost 200 years ago. So for epidemiologists studying the coronavirus today, that scale is still gauged by the mundane act of counting, right? We still count, and the counting starts with descriptive statistics on the daily state of the pandemic, who's infected, who's sick, how many have died, and then those numbers are used to forecast the pandemic's future, which lets officials plan and mobilize resources. Epidemiologists use those data to discern patterns over time and among different groups of people, and to determine reasons some get sick and others don't. That's the hard part of epidemiology. I think there should be a paragraph break here. All right, so and one of the things that I have found really interesting over the last couple of weeks that I've sort of picked up on is some of the distinctions that we already knew about in terms of COVID, right? That Black people and other people of color tend to get sicker. Both more of them get sick, and they tend to get sicker than other people. The other thing that was that made sort of a big splash earlier in the pandemic, but I hadn't heard as much about it recently, is the disparity between men and women. That men are much more likely to get sick of COVID than women, and to get sicker. And one of the things that I heard.
Did you take your rest?
Say,
Did you take a rest already?
yes, I did.
One of the things I've heard recently is that one of the reasons for that might be that women, by and large, have stronger immune systems than men. And I learned this in the context of a radio program that had to do with the overwhelming disparity in the number of cases of autoimmune diseases that are much more likely to happen among women than among men. And one of the reasons they think for that, one of the hypotheses is actually that the fact that women have two X chromosomes, and that essentially they get double the what did I just say? What's the word I just said? Immunity. Double the immune system in order to take care of babies when they're pregnant. And that one of the reasons for increased incidence of autoimmune diseases is that women don't get pregnant as often as they used to because of birth control, which I found really interesting. I don't know if it's true or not, but
Do they have any true reasons for that stipulation? Or is it pie in the sky
What stipulation, Sandy?
that women have two X chromosomes and so they don't get sick?
Right. Well, I mean, they were sort of talking about it as sort of part of the genetic sweepstakes, right? You get two X chromosomes, so you have really, really strong immunity, right? So you don't get the flu as often, and you don't get COVID as easily. And on the other hand, you have these really strong immune systems, so that they can sort of turn on you, and you can end up with a problem.
Do they have any proof of that?
Yeah, they have a lot of proof, but it's still a hypothesis. As I said, it's not a. There are these women that are studying. There's these women that are studying the effect of placentas. What's the point of a placenta, right? And how in a sense being pregnant is sort of like a little bit of a war of attrition between the mother and the baby. And really fascinating research. But my point of bringing it up, right, is that there are all of these differences between various categories of people in terms of who gets sick and what they get sick from. And unless we do the counting, right, we won't know where to begin with trying to figure out how to address some of these issues. But yeah, if I remember, Sandy, I'll try to remember to figure out what program that was on the radio that was talking about this. But I found it to be really, really fascinating in terms of the distinction. First of all, the distinction between men and women in terms of the immune system, and then also why we have all of this incidence of immune, these immune reactive diseases that are so much more common among women than among men. All right, so we know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus is the cause of COVID-19. And in that sense, the story is very simple. But why does one exposed person get infected and not another? Despite more than 200 million detected cases worldwide, scientists still don't understand much about transmission, nor what makes an infected person sick enough to be hospitalized beyond simple demographics like age and sex. It's always something. Right. So, and again, like this is one of those things that always impresses me, right? When the argument comes about, we just need to believe the science. Like, yeah, we do. And right, the science doesn't know much, right? We don't know for real what we need to know, right? There's so many things we don't know. We're still trying to figure it out. And pretending that we know when we don't is actually not that helpful. So nearly, and then how much we actually do know so much, right? Nearly 500,000 scientific papers have now been published on COVID-19. So who has read all of those papers? Go ahead, Jean.
A lot of those papers are scientific preprints that are online before they're peer reviewed.
Right.
So that's not the final word in research.
At all. And even if they were peer reviewed, right? I mean, all scientific papers are a report on the research being done by a specific researcher, right? And so it's a contribution to knowledge. It's not the be all and end all of a particular question. So these papers marshal a dizzying array of hypotheses, right? So I just talked about one hypothesis that I heard about on the radio, right, about autoimmune diseases, right? But that it's a hypothesis. It could be accurate. It might not be accurate, right? But it's just fascinating how it seems to fit into what I already know, right? But these papers marshal a dizzying array of hypotheses to explain the patterns observed. But a vast majority of those conjectures quickly fizzle out, right? Most of them are wrong. Numerous studies early on noted the relative absence of COVID-19 cases in Africa and South Asia, for example, leading to many environmental, genetic, and behavior. Oh, we lost Jean. Environmental, genetic, and behavioral conjectures until suddenly African countries and India were devastated by soaring caseloads. Thus, so many epidemiological theories came and went, such as the impacts of altitude and blood type. But one consistent association held on, and it's the same one that Dr. Virchow found in Upper Silesia. Our current pandemic is socially patterned. This remains one of the few pervasive observations that consistently describes risks of infection, hospitalizations, and death from COVID-19 around the world. Yet while wealth correlates with those who can work from home and order groceries online in rich countries, it explains less well the patterns among larger aggregations of people across states and nations. At this level, it appears that the more salient features that distinguish pandemic severity are relational factors like economic equality and social trust. It comes as no surprise to even the casual observer that the pandemic struck most ferociously in countries riven with political division and social conflict. Although it's interesting, that may be true, but I don't associate Italy, for instance, with political division and social conflict, but maybe it's true. But since that was like the first place that it really, maybe that was just because it was so early.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting. Like, for example, consider the number of excess deaths across countries during the pandemic. Looking at those countries most severely affected, such as Peru, Bolivia, South Africa, and Brazil, one sees mostly middle-income countries in political turmoil and with weak social institutions. Countries that had fewer deaths than would be expected based on pre-pandemic trends, on the other hand, are often richer, but also distinguished by high levels of political cohesiveness, social trust, income equality and collectivism, like New Zealand, Taiwan, Norway, Iceland, Japan, Singapore, and Denmark. Right? I mean, like, we all want to move to New Zealand, right? Actually, one of the reasons I want to move to New Zealand is because my new favorite band comes from there. And I really like this band. So like, if I want to hear them in concert, I guess I have to go all the way to New Zealand. Maybe I'll move there.
It's
They don't
supposed to
want
be
you.
very beautiful.
What did you say, Gene?
I said they probably
Very
don't want you.
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's easier to see them online than to travel to New Zealand. Although my parents moved to didn't move there. They traveled to New Zealand and Australia, and they really, really like New Zealand. So maybe someday I'll be able to see it. Many investigators have reached similar conclusions in research within and among countries on measures of political polarization, social capital, trust in government, and income inequality. It makes sense that political polarization hampers effective pandemic response. But this is where explanatory inference gets trickiest, because we epidemiologists exist like everyone else inside the social forces that shape the pandemic. Right? And I think this is the other thing that people often want to forget, right? That scientists are citizens, right? They are part of the social fabric, right? We are citizens as well as scientists. None of us immune to politicization and the way that it distorts perceptions and inferences, right? And I think this gets, again, at some of the criticism, say, of the CDC, whether under Trump or under Biden, right? That, somehow people are looking for a ivory tower response where, that would be a lot to ask, given the fact that these are just people like the rest of us. For example, how did the effectiveness of a drug like hydroxychloroquine become a political litmus test rather than a question for dispassionate clinical study, right? And even more so, ivermectin, right? That one that is a horse pill, right? The idea of using horse pills against COVID just makes no sense to me, but it does seem to be something that's very, holds a lot of meaning for people. Nothing is gained when basic scientific and policy questions become ideological footballs to be inflated and tossed around. The United States is the dominant biomedical research entity in the world, and so its flagrant political dysfunction became a global problem. This infused everything that we epidemiologists did with doubt, suspicion, and the whiff of partisanship. Politics has dogged us at every turn in these past 18 months. Astonishing failings at the CDC and FDA under political appointees, the politicization of proven interventions like masks and vaccines, and more. Take the return to in-person schooling. By April 2020, over 3/4 of the world's school children were at home, yet we quickly learned enough to safely reopen schools for younger children with measures like masking and ventilation. And this is indeed what happened in much of Canada, Europe, and Asia. But that progress from evidence to policy hit a brick wall in the US when the Trump administration aggressively promoted resumption of in-person schooling as a crucial step towards economic recovery. When the former president threw his weight behind the priority that children should be back in classrooms, blue state politicians, teachers unions, and many epidemiologists were adamantly opposed. Rational discourse about the policy question became all but impossible. Every interpretation of evidence became colored by the suspicion that it was in the service of a political allegiance. And I think it's really important, right, that he's pointing out something where, those of us who live in the blue states, right, were the ones who, by and large, were focused on, on opposing this in, who knows to what degree it was in because Trump was in favor of it, right, and who knows how much of it was because of just the general atmosphere of distrust that had already become just so overwhelming, right? We're talking, this is, I mean, April 2020, this is right at the beginning, right? Many of the things that we've been dealing with could have been avoided, right? If we had been able to get younger kids back to school earlier. But science is a social process, and we all live amid the social soup of personalities, parties, and power. The political dysfunction that holds America hostage also holds science hostage. And I think that's really the crucial point, right? That Dr. Virchow wrote that mass disease means that society is out of joint, right? If we can't fix stuff, right, it's not because of necessarily the left or the right. It's easy, right, to and desirable very often to find a scapegoat, right? Let's blame Trump. Let's blame the Democrats, whatever, right? But it's, you know, the root of the problem, right, is a society that's out of joint. And societies being out of joint means that epidemiological research is out of joint because it exists in the same society. This is not a new problem, but the dominant follow the science mantra misses the fact that the same social pathology that exacerbates the pandemic also debilitates our scientific response to it, which I think is really, it's really sobering, right? That is the case. And it's hard for scientists even to figure out what is actually the case because they themselves live inside the same social pressures. So you have doctors who are, I mean, the example now, right, of doctors who are beginning to recognize that their work is sort of intrinsically political, right? If that's been the case for many years, right? For anyone who does OBGYN, right, and provides abortion services, right, their work has been politicized for, you know, for more than 50 years, and even longer than that, right? And so in Texas, people are, you know, we now have doctors who are performing abortions in defiance of the law, right, as an attempt to have that law overturned in court. And so, you know, and we also have, you know, I heard, you know, just the headline. So I you know, this is the problem, of course, with reading only the headlines, that, you know, there is one high-risk OBGYN in West Virginia, and he believes that he supposedly believes that abortion is never necessary to save the life of a mother. And if that's actually the case, like, whoa, that's a whole other thing. But it's very hard, right, when you've got doctors who are saying that ivermectin works on COVID to really think that that science is somehow outside of societal pressures. To restore faith in science, there must be faith in social institutions more broadly, and this requires a political reckoning. Of course, one can cite many specific challenges for scientists. The wheels are coming off the peer review system, right? Which, Gene, you've already mentioned, right? That people just do research and throw it up on the internet without any peer review. And so crazy ideas become accessible to everybody. University research is plagued by commercialization pressures, which I know for a fact from people I know who stopped being able to get grants because their work doesn't meet, it doesn't have commercial value, and so on. But all of these are the symptoms, not the underlying disease. The real problem is simply that sick societies have sick institutions. Science is not some cloistered preserve in the clouds, but is buried in the muck with everything else. This is why just 8 days after his investigation and Upper Silencia, Dr. Virchow went to the barricades in Berlin to fight for the revolution. 8 days, it didn't take him very long. All right, so that's the end. All right, so I open it for thoughts. Julia, you've been quiet.
I've been listening.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's a good point. I think it's an important point to remember and to hold as we, read the news and get all riled up on all of our sides of the issue, and just taking a step back to see the bigger picture. It's really
Yeah.
important.
I guess that's right. That's the point of this, right? Is that, we really need to fix our society, right? In pretty drastic ways. It's not really clear what the fix is, at least to me. Sandy, any thoughts?
What can I say? You see doctors advertising now very much more than they had been before because business is slow.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
I mean,
MGH is all of a sudden advertising.
yeah,
The doctor is not always right.
well,
Society has finally figured out.
well, that's actually really interesting. I think is, that we're on one hand, we are in an era, right, where there's this mantra, as he says, right? What's the mantra? Follow the science, right? Follow the doctors, right? But we're also in an era, right, where Sandy, I wasn't alive in the 50s, but from what I understand, the 50s and the 60s, based on reading that I've done, based on stories from people who were alive in those days, right, that doctors were really not questioned back then, right? That there was a sort of a real sort of paternalism, and just that very often doctors wouldn't even tell patients what was going on with them. They would just say, do this, or you need an operation, or whatever. And there wasn't, patients weren't necessarily invited into the decision-making process about their care.
Right.
So it's really interesting to me that on one hand, right, we are in an era where doctors are not sort of just, trusted without question as much as they used to be. Yet still we have this sort of idea that, we just need to follow the science. We just stop being so partisan about this, stop being so emotional about this and follow the science. So we have sort of both of these at the same time. Yeah, go ahead, Jean.
It's sort of like the dilemma with climate change,
Yeah,
that you can find researchers on both sides that climate change is a problem and that climate change doesn't exist.
right.
But the fact is that the overwhelming number of scientists believe in climate change, and
Right.
just a very small proportion don't. And it's the same with medical research, that the overwhelming number of reputable medical researchers would say that horse medicine is not appropriate for patients, but a few would say, yes, it is.
Right.
So you don't say, well, look, doctors on both sides,
Right.
you've got to make a qualitative judgment that, 90% of doctors say such and such,
Right.
rather than saying there's something on both sides.
Yeah. And which is a really complicated, what's the word I'm looking for? A calculation to make, right? Because you said you need to make a qualitative determination, right? Which I think is really interesting because we're, in a sense, we're talking about a quantitative factor, right? That the vast majority of medical professionals do not recommend ivermectin, right? The horse medicine for COVID. But we have in this country sort of this, we have the sort of the cowboy mentality, right? The lone researcher who's going to come up with the, with the truth against the scientific hegemony, and that sort of narrative is a very appealing to certain people.
We have to be more sophisticated users of information.
100%.
To be able to distinguish between the quack Texas doctor and the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Right. I mean, 100%. And I'm with you on that. And I'm also sort of aware, right, that, the number of people in a number of different realms, right, less maybe less dire than the use of useless drugs or dangerous drugs, in response to COVID, right? That the degree to which people have their own opinions about scientific information is it's really interesting, right? Just nutrition is a realm, right, where people have so many different opinions about stuff, and they can all find some sort of scientific authority to back them up. Yeah, go ahead, Jean.
The other issue about the prevalence of COVID in communities of color, if you look at underlying research, which is pretty reliable, it's not because they're people of color, it's because they have a much higher incidence of obesity, high blood pressure, underlying conditions that make them more vulnerable.
Right.
So it seems to me that there's some questions on which the data is really almost incontrovertible.
Yeah, yeah. Right. No, it seems to me, right, that and also, just like right now, this is another part of the whole sort of national conversation I don't understand, right, is that there clearly seems to be a difference between states where vaccine rates are high and where masking protocols are clear, and those where those things are not the case. But again, that data does not seem to be driving policy in many places, which again I just don't understand. And so even though I'm completely with this Dr. Kaufman, right, on remembering, right, that follow the science is not always simple, right? Sometimes it still seems simpler than he suggests, but maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, go ahead, Jean.
I just wanted to add that in the 1960s, when Jim and I were in graduate school in California, I was at Berkeley, and I was just reading letters that he sent to me, and it was during the time that Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and one of the first things that he did was to propose a across-the-board 10% cut in the University of California budget, and really went after the chancellor of the University of California, and I think really did a lot to start undermining people's confidence in higher education and the whole purpose of a research university.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that has been sort of a right-wing staple, right? Is, to complain about the academy, complain about research, right? To demean basic research, right, as not worth the time. It's a large and ongoing problem. Not helped necessarily by many of us who want our children to have lucrative professions.
One of the reasons I was so glad you picked this article was that the writer is a professor at McGill in Montreal, you mentioned, and our grandson Oscar has just started at McGill as a first-year student, and he's
that's great.
He's there to study science. So
that's really fascinating.
This article.
That's great. McGill was one of the places that I sort of had an idea that I might want to go when I was a kid, because I had this idea that I would enjoy living in Canada. But I was too timid. I didn't want to go too far away from home. So I ended up in when I was in college, my parents lived in northern Connecticut and I was in central Massachusetts, so I was not too far from home. But,
Montreal isn't that far from Brookline, so.
no, I mean, now it feels not so far, but back in the day, it felt like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be so cold now, whatever. That was my teenage self, not my mid-50s self, so we changed. Luckily, we grow a little bit. But that's great. Has he been having a good time so far? It's early days yet.
Yes, he's having a great time. He has a roommate from Toronto.
Oh, good.
He was there just in time for the Canadian election, which I think is today.
Oh, wow.
You
I
know,
didn't even realize, is it for prime minister?
it's whoever wins control of parliament will choose the
Right.
prime minister.
Right.
Trudeau is actually at risk of losing his majority, or he's not even a majority now, he's the plurality. So
Oh, okay.
he was looking good at first, but now he's at risk.
Interesting. That'll be really fascinating if, because it strikes me that there are fewer and fewer center right movements now, and that most people that would call themselves conservatives are actually radicals and reactionary, and so I'm hoping that will not be the case that won't be the case in Canada.
And he can also compare how the Canadians are doing with COVID.
Right. Yeah, I have to say, I really don't know how it's gone in Canada vis-a-vis COVID.
Pretty well.
Yeah. Certainly better than here, I would imagine. There still does seem to be a little bit more social cohesion up there than down around here. But all right, well, thank you both. Thank you, Sandy. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you as well.
And I hope, I'm sure that at some point I'm going to ask Julia to take over the hot seat here for these sessions. So you'll be seeing more of her, I hope.
I look forward to it.
Okay,
Very
nice
good.
to meet you, Julia.
Thank you.
To meet you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.